Welcome to Crime Documentary, the channel where shadows of the past are brought back to life and the most terrifying truths are revealed. Tonight, we dive into one of America's darkest nightmares, a predator who stalked the suburbs of California with cold precision. He was clever, merciless, and invisible, striking without leaving a trace. For decades, he haunted families, leaving behind shattered lives and unanswered questions. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished, leaving law enforcement chasing. A ghost for 40 long years. This is not just a story of crime, but of fear, obsession, and ultimate revelation. It all began in the quiet suburbs of Sacramento, California, where rows of modest homes and tree-lined streets painted the picture of the American dream. Families felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Children rode their bikes freely until the streetlights came on, and neighbors trusted one another with spare keys. It was the kind of place where danger seemed distant, where violence was something people only saw on the evening news. But in 1976, that illusion of safety began to unravel, and with it came the birth of a nightmare that would stalk California for more than a decade. At first, it seemed like a series of petty burglaries. Strange intrusions into homes where nothing of great value was taken, but the victims noticed details that felt far more sinister than just theft. Drawers had been rifled through, photographs had been moved, and items of personal, intimate value were gone. Women began reporting that they felt watched, that phone calls filled with silence or heavy breathing followed them, and that at night, noises outside their homes gave them an eerie sense that someone was out there in the dark. What the police didn't realize then was that these were not random crimes of opportunity. The man behind them was studying his victims, selecting them with a chilling precision, and practicing for what he intended to unleash. Soon, the burglaries escalated into home invasions. The intruder was no longer content to sneak in and out. Unseen, he entered homes while people were inside, using the cover of darkness to gain control. Victims awoke to the sound of footsteps or the blinding glare of a flashlight in their faces. The attacker wore a ski mask, his voice low and commanding. And he carried with him the tools of control rope, shoelaces, and a weapon that showed he was willing to enforce his threats. Women were bound, men were tied up and rendered powerless, and what followed was a wave of terror that spread through Sacramento like wildfire. He knew exactly how to make people feel helpless. Men were forced to lie face down, bound tightly, sometimes with plates stacked on their backs so that if they moved or tried to resist, the intruder would hear the clatter and know instantly. While husbands and boyfriends were immobilized, they were forced to listen as their wives and girlfriends endured horrors they could do nothing to stop. The predator relished in control, turning the sanctity of the suburban home into a prison of fear. Each attack was meticulously planned. He had stalked the homes beforehand, peering through windows, learning routines, even calling victims to let them know he was watching. Neighbors later recalled seeing a suspicious man on a bicycle, or noticing footprints in their yards, small warnings that something was amiss. Yet he always managed to slip away before anyone could catch him. It wasn't just his cunning that terrified people, it was his ability to vanish without a trace. Law enforcement was thrown into chaos. Detectives worked tirelessly, forming task forces, conducting neighborhood sweeps, and pleading with the public for tips. But every time they thought they were closing in, he shifted tactics, moving from one neighborhood to another, striking at random, leaving behind a trail of trauma, but no concrete evidence that could point to his identity. For the residents of Sacramento, fear became part of daily life. Families bought guard dogs, installed extra locks, and formed neighborhood watch groups, patrolling the streets late into the night. Gun sales soared as people who had never considered owning firearms now slept with them at their bedside. Mothers warned their children never to answer the door, and couples found themselves questioning every creak in the night. The predator wasn't just breaking into homes, he was breaking into the very psychology of an entire community. And yet, Despite the overwhelming fear, there was something almost methodical in the way he operated. He didn't strike impulsively. He stalked his victims for days or even weeks, memorizing their schedules, studying the layout of their homes, and finding weaknesses in their security. Victims often reported seeing suspicious figures in their yards or receiving disturbing phone calls before the attacks. He was a hunter, and California had become his hunting ground. Survivors described his chilling demeanor. His voice was low, sometimes a forced whisper, commanding obedience. He wasn't rushed or panicked, even when victims pleaded or resisted. It was as if he derived satisfaction from the fear itself, feeding off the terror he instilled. He took his time, sometimes staying in homes for hours, eating food from the refrigerator, rummaging through belongings, or whispering threats that victims would never forget. The attacks grew in number, and soon the media picked up on the story. Headlines about a masked rapist terrorizing Sacramento filled newspapers, and news broadcasts warned viewers to stay vigilant. The name East Area Rapist was given to the predator, and with it came an even deeper sense of dread. He wasn't just another criminal, he was a phantom, a faceless figure who could strike anywhere, at any time. Panic set in as reports of his attacks multiplied. By 1977, he had struck dozens of times, leaving behind traumatized victims who struggled to return to normal life. The community was under siege, and law enforcement faced a chilling realization: this wasn't going to stop. He was escalating, becoming bolder with each attack, and there was no telling how far he would go. The suburban dream had turned into a waking nightmare, and no one felt safe within their own homes. Families who once left doors unlocked now lived in fortresses, their sense of security shattered. And yet, for all the efforts to catch him, the predator always slipped away, melting back into the night like he was never there. He had become a shadow that California couldn't shake, a presence that haunted every locked door and drawn curtain, a predator who thrived on fear itself. By the late 1970s, the attacks that had begun as burglaries and assaults transformed into something darker and far more horrifying. The masked intruder who had terrorized Sacramento neighborhoods no longer seemed satisfied with breaking into homes, binding his victims, and leaving them traumatized. His crimes escalated, and his hunger for control and violence reached its most chilling stage: murder. The predator evolved from a rapist into a killer, and his crimes began leaving behind not just scars, but bodies. The first murders connected to the man who had become known as the East Area Rapist sent shockwaves through California. Couples were targeted inside their homes, ambushed in the very spaces where they should have felt most safe. Investigators discovered scenes of unimaginable brutality, victims tied up, entire households turned into chambers of fear, and then silence. The kind of silence that only death leaves behind. It became clear to detectives that this was no ordinary criminal. They were not dealing with someone who killed in desperation or panic. These were carefully orchestrated murders, calculated down to the smallest detail, carried out with the cold precision of someone who had rehearsed terror over and over again. The killer struck in different counties, stretching law enforcement resources thin. Each jurisdiction had its own police force, its own files, its own priorities, and communication between departments was limited. The predator exploited these weaknesses, moving like a phantom across northern and then southern California, leaving investigators scrambling to connect the dots. What some officers thought were isolated crimes, rapes in one county, murders in another, slowly began to weave together into a single tapestry of violence. Detectives realized with growing horror that this was the same man, refining his methods and growing bolder with every strike. The press began using different names to describe him. In Sacramento, he was still called the East Area Rapist, but in Southern California, where he began murdering couples in their homes, he became known as the original Night Stalker. These names reflected the scope of his terror, but they also revealed the confusion of the time. People didn't yet know these were the same person, the same predator who was evolving from one type of crime to another. It would take years before investigators pieced together that the rapist and the killer were one and the same, the man who would ultimately be remembered as the Golden State Killer. His method of operation remained eerily familiar. He studied his victims, stalking them for days before the attack. He slipped into backyards, peered through windows, learned routines, and selected the exact moment to strike. When he entered a home, he took control with terrifying authority. Husbands and boyfriends were tied up and rendered powerless, plates stacked on their backs to detect movement, while wives and girlfriends endured his sadistic cruelty. But now, the aftermath ended differently. The predator no longer left victims alive to tell their stories. Instead, he murdered them, sometimes bludgeoning them, sometimes shooting them, and always leaving behind a haunting signature of control and domination. Murders devastated entire communities. Families lived in constant fear, convinced they could be next. People who had once cherished the privacy of their homes now found themselves unable to sleep through the night, listening for footsteps or whispers outside their windows. Communities that had felt safe and suburban suddenly resembled battlefields, with residents arming themselves and forming neighborhood patrols. Gun sales soared, locks were reinforced, and strangers were eyed with suspicion. The predator had managed to do something few criminals ever achieve. He had turned entire regions of California into his personal hunting ground, holding millions of people hostage with fear. Investigators were desperate to stop him. Task forces were created, and law enforcement poured resources into the case. They analyzed footprints, fibers, knots in ropes, and even the way he tied his shoelaces. But he was always one step ahead, careful to avoid leaving fingerprints or identifiable traces. His knowledge of police procedures suggested to some detectives that he might have a background in law enforcement or the military. His ability to vanish into the night after each crime, despite roadblocks and massive manhunts, added to the aura of mystery surrounding him. He seemed to anticipate every move the police made, and that only deepened the dread. The media, fueled by the public's hunger for answers, covered the crimes relentlessly. Newspapers printed stories about the masked rapist turned killer, and television anchors warned viewers to remain vigilant. But the coverage also spread terror. Women lived in fear of being alone, and men dreaded the possibility of being unable to protect their families. Parents worried about their children, and entire neighborhoods were gripped by paranoia. Every creak in the night, every dog's bark, every flicker of light outside a window became a potential warning that the predator was near. As his crimes continued, investigators began to connect the rapes in Northern California to the murders in the South. The realization was staggering. The same man responsible for more than 50 assaults was now committing murders hundreds of miles away. He wasn't just a local threat, he was a predator spanning the entire state. This revelation shifted the investigation into high gear, but it also made the case even more complicated. Different police departments had to learn to work together, sharing files and evidence in an era before modern databases and technology. Still, despite their best efforts, he remained out of reach. Victims who survived his earlier attacks carried the weight of trauma with them for years. Their testimonies painted a chilling portrait of the predator's control. They described the way he whispered threats, how he moved with calm authority, and how his rage sometimes slipped through in bursts of violence. Some recalled the eerie feeling that he had been inside their homes before the attack, leaving them with the disturbing thought that he might have walked among them in broad daylight, blending in as a neighbor, a passerby, or even someone they trusted. The Golden State Killer wasn't just taking lives, he was rewriting the very psychology of safety. Californians who once believed in the sanctity of home no longer felt protected by walls or locks. Couples who once saw their houses as havens now viewed them as traps. The predator had changed the way people lived, embedding fear into the daily routines of countless families. By the end of the 1970s, he had struck dozens of times, and his body count was growing. Police sketches, composites, and psychological profiles were released to the public, but none brought them closer to his identity. He was faceless, nameless, a phantom who thrived on fear. Each new murder felt like a message to the authorities. No matter how hard you try, you can't stop me. And as the years pressed on, that message rang louder with every victim he claimed. And then, without warning, the chaos that had consumed California for a decade suddenly stopped. In 1986, after years of relentless terror, the predator who had stalked neighborhoods, broken into homes, and left behind a trail of shattered lives seemed to vanish into thin air. No more reports of break-ins with ski masks, no more couples found murdered in their beds, no more whispered threats in the dark. The silence was almost deafening, and for the investigators who had devoted years of their lives to chasing him, it was a silence that felt as frustrating as it was eerie. The man they had come to know as the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, had disappeared without leaving a trace. Detectives pored over the evidence again and again, searching for something they had missed. They revisited crime scenes, re-interviewed survivors, and combed through thousands of tips, but the trail had gone cold. Some officers believed he had died, perhaps killed in an accident or another crime. Others thought he might have been imprisoned under another name, serving time for an unrelated offense, hidden away from the world while his true crimes remained buried in cold case files. There were even those who believed he had simply grown older, decided to stop, and blended back into society, walking among the very communities he had once terrorized. The not knowing was almost worse than the crimes themselves. For the victims and their families, the sudden silence brought no relief. Survivors lived with the weight of trauma, haunted by memories of being tied up, threatened, and assaulted by a masked intruder who had stripped away their sense of safety. Families of murder victims had no closure, only unanswered questions about why their loved ones had been taken and who had done it. Every day, they wondered if he was still out there, if he lived next door, if he was watching them even now. His absence did not erase the fear he had planted, it made it grow in ways more insidious and lasting. Communities struggled to move forward, but the shadow of the predator lingered. People locked their doors more tightly, checked their windows twice before going to bed, and jumped at noises in the night. Even as years turned into decades, the memory of his crimes refused to fade. For those who lived through his reign of terror, the Golden State Killer was not just a headline from the past. He was a ghost that lived in every dark corner, every rustling branch outside a window, every creak of a floorboard at midnight. Law enforcement faced the painful reality that the case was slipping further from their grasp with each passing year. Advances in forensic science offered hope, but in the 1980s and 1990s, DNA technology was still in its infancy. Detectives preserved what evidence they could, praying that someday, somehow, science would give them the key they needed. For now, all they had were boxes of files, endless hours of tape-recorded interviews, and crime scene photos that told stories without ever naming the man behind them. The predator had simply vanished, and the silence that followed was perhaps his cruelest weapon of all. As time went on, new generations of investigators inherited the case. They studied the patterns, the reports, the testimonies, and they could almost feel his presence through the details. The way he tied knots with precision, the way he whispered threats in a low, deliberate voice, the way he seemed to anticipate every move police made. But all of it was just fragments, pieces of a puzzle with no picture. They gave him a new name, the Golden State Killer, hoping that unifying his crimes under one title would keep the case alive in the public consciousness. Yet still, there were no answers, only theories and the lingering sense of unfinished business. The victims' families gathered year after year at vigils and memorials, their grief as raw as the day the crimes had happened. They pushed for answers, refused to let the case fade into obscurity, and demanded that law enforcement never give up. But with no suspect, no new evidence, and no fresh leads, detectives had little to offer beyond the same reassurances that they were still trying. To the families, the predator had stolen more than lives, he had stolen peace, justice, and time itself. Rumors filled the void left by his disappearance. Some speculated that he was still out there, living a normal life with a family of his own, perhaps even sitting down at dinner tables or attending PTA meetings like any other suburban neighbor. Others believed he had fled California, starting over somewhere new where no one knew his past. There were whispers that he could have been in law enforcement all along, hiding in plain sight, using his knowledge of police procedures to evade capture. Each theory carried its own horror, and none could be proven. For over 40 years, the case remained frozen, suspended in the kind of limbo that gnawed at everyone involved. Detectives retired without answers, survivors aged while carrying scars from their youth, and families buried loved ones without justice. The Golden State Killer had managed to do the unthinkable. He had disappeared so completely that it was as if he had never existed. Except for the memories etched into those he had victimized, the silence of his absence became its own kind of terror. Every time a new crime made headlines, people wondered if it could be him returning. Every unsolved murder carried with it the chilling possibility that the predator had struck again under a different name. And yet, year after year, there was nothing, no fingerprints, no sightings, no confessions. Just silence stretching across decades, mocking everyone who had tried to stop him. Still, the hunt never truly stopped. Even when the trail was cold, even when the case files gathered dust, there were always a handful of investigators, journalists, and survivors who refused to let his name be forgotten. They carried the story forward, keeping it alive for a future where answers might finally be possible. The Golden State Killer might have vanished, but the memory of his terror remained vivid, a wound on California's history that time alone could not heal. For more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer remained a faceless shadow, a name whispered in fear, a mystery that haunted California's past. Generations of detectives had tried to uncover him, but he always slipped through their fingers. Families of the victims had learned to live with unanswered questions, their grief and trauma stretching across decades like scars that refused to fade. It seemed as though he would remain one of history's greatest unsolved predators, a phantom, destined to live forever in the darkness of cold case files. But then, in 2018, everything changed. That technology had advanced in ways investigators of the 1970s and 80s could never have imagined. Forensic DNA databases had grown, and a new tool, genetic genealogy, emerged as a revolutionary method of solving crimes. Detectives preserved DNA evidence from the Golden State Killer's crime scenes for years, hoping one day it would prove useful. Now with the new technology, that hope turned into action. Using genealogical websites where people uploaded their DNA to learn about their ancestry, investigators built family trees, searching for connections that could lead them to the man who had eluded them for so long. Piece by piece, branch by branch, the tree began to narrow down, until all signs pointed to a single suspect, Joseph James D'Angelo. The name was shocking. D'Angelo was not a drifter or a nameless criminal. He was a retired police officer, a man who had once worn the badge, sworn to serve and protect. He had lived in suburban neighborhoods, raised a family, worked at grocery stores after retiring from the force. He blended into society so perfectly that no one suspected he carried with him the darkest secret in California's history. For decades, he had hidden in plain sight, living an ordinary life while carrying the blood of countless victims on his hands. The revelation chilled everyone who heard it. The predator who had terrorized thousands of people was not only real, but had been walking among them all along. In April 2018, law enforcement moved in. D'Angelo, by then 72 years old, was arrested outside his home in Citrus Heights, a quiet suburb of Sacramento not far from where his crimes began. The arrest sent shockwaves across the country. Images of the frail, elderly man in handcuffs flooded the news, and people struggled to reconcile the weak-looking figure with the monstrous shadow that had once paralyzed California. Yet the DNA was undeniable. The phantom had finally been unmasked, and the truth was more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The trial that followed gave survivors and families of victims something they had long been denied answers. In 2020, Joseph D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. He also admitted to dozens of rapes and burglaries that had passed the statute of limitations. In the courtroom, survivors faced him at last, no longer bound by ropes or silenced by fear. They told their stories, voices trembling but strong, as they looked directly at the man who had stolen so much from them. Their words carried decades of pain, but also decades of resilience. They had survived him, even when they thought they wouldn't. And now he was the one stripped of power. D'Angelo sat quietly through the proceedings, often showing little emotion, his frail frame a stark contrast to the violent predator he once was. Occasionally, he muttered apologies, but to many, his words meant nothing compared to the lives he destroyed. In August 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At last, the victims and their families had the justice they had been waiting for, justice that had seemed impossible for so long. The Golden State Killer would die behind bars, no longer a free man, no longer a shadow lurking in the night. But even with justice served, the scars of his crimes remained. Survivors carried the memories of their ordeals. Families still grieved for loved ones lost, and entire communities never fully reclaimed the sense of safety that had been shattered decades earlier. The Golden State Killer's legacy was one of fear, trauma, and the reminder that evil can wear the mask of the ordinary. Yet his capture also told another story, the story of persistence, of how investigators refused to give up, of how survivors found their voices, and of how justice, no matter how delayed, can still be achieved. The story of Joseph James D'Angelo is more than the story of a serial killer. It is the story of how darkness can live undetected for years, how evil can disguise itself in the most ordinary of faces, and how the relentless pursuit of truth can finally pierce even the blackest shadow. It is the story of communities bound by fear but also by resilience, of victims who refuse to be silenced, and of investigators who refuse to let the case die. In the end, the predator who once controlled the night was dragged into the light, exposed not as a phantom but as a man who could finally be held accountable. The Golden State Killer had vanished for 40 years, but justice never stopped hunting him. His capture closed one of America's darkest chapters, proving that even the longest shadows cannot hide from the truth forever. And while his crimes will never be forgotten, neither will the strength of those who endured them. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror ended not with another scream in the dark, but with the clang of a prison door shutting behind him forever.